morning, good afternoon, and to some of you guys, good evening. Welcome to another Saturday Free Show edition of This is Revolution Podcast. We call this the Saturday Free Show because remember, we do not stop. Usually we keep our shows, we try being the key word here to keep the shows at a tight hour, and then we go into the bonus patrons only champagne room. And on Saturdays, there is no champagne room. The party is with y'all. That being said, if you are new to the channel, please hit like, please hit subscribe, please hit that bell so you are notified whenever we have new shows, because we're changing things to the channel constantly, always adding new programming. This Monday coming up, we're going to have another episode of our brand new sports show, Beyond the Red Zone, where we're going to take a look at all the crazy NFL trades, and we're going to look at something Deion Sanders had to say about NFL teams not showing up to the Black College Pro Days. What's going on with that? Also, we want to promote those of us in the TIR universe whenever they do something wonderful. And yesterday, I got a WhatsApp message very early in the morning from Deutsche World requesting the services of one Pascal Robert. So let me bring in the man of the Mau Mau Hour and famed Deutsche World guest host appearance person, the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles. Give me that house, the music.
I was listening to so for those that don't know, we can't play copyrighted material on the show, because if we do, they'll either pull it down or they'll make it non-monetizable shows. And it's not like we're making a bunch of money on these shows. So the music that you didn't generally hear is music that I make. But before the show, before we were on air, and I don't even know if Pascal had a chance to hear it, I was playing not necessarily house music, but a derivative of house. One of my favorite artists, Goldie, Inner City Life. I remember that track dropped in '94, and I remember buying an import at a local record store in Berkeley, California, and that was my trip down to house, techno, trip hop, acid jazz lane. And I don't think I ever really turned back from it. Even the music that I still create, while guitar heavy, is definitely influenced by those mid-90s sounds that were actually emanating more so out of the UK. I can't say that I was that influenced by the sounds that came before out of Detroit. I think as close as I got to that stuff, because I am a little younger than Pascal, was like CeCe Peniston, which was definitely the mainstream of the house music blow up. What about you, Pascal?
Bro, you gotta understand, man. I'm old enough to remember disco. I couldn't go to the disco. I was too young for that, but I remember the music. I have a lot of older cousins. My cousin DJ Easy Al was a DJ from like the late 70s. So house music, though it does start in the late 70s, early 80s, that was the music of my college years. Let me tell you something. Let me tell you what was really interesting about my college years, right? You have golden age of hip hop.
Mm-hmm.
You have the rise of the popularity of Jamaican dance hall. And you have house music. The college parties in my era were off the meat racks.
I'm not saying it's not, man. So there was a documentary on house music that I, for whatever reason, totally forgot about, and it didn't hit me until midnight, Pascal and Marcus's time to send it to him. Actually, let me bring in Marcus to the left flank. Vets.
What's up? I can't wait.
You have an interesting history with disco as well, even in your young years.
Yeah, because I was like, so my parents were seated firmly in the disco era.
Mhm.
And that's actually when my parents came to the United States. But yeah, when I was a kid, I ended up buying a I don't know, like one of those compilation disco like disco CDs because I was like, you guys used to play this, but you don't play it anymore. And I was like, I need to hear some more of this. Um, so yeah, I mean,
I
it's
think one
all
of the
there.
greatest things about hip hop that no one really talks about too much is that it makes people go back into the other music that makes hip hop.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe all music does that, right? You always want to know what influenced the people that influence you.
Well, that's where
But
with sampling, it's more direct, you know?
yes,
Like
yes,
with
it is more
sampling,
direct.
it's like, you know, this is coming from somewhere else. And that sounds pretty dope. So maybe let me check that out real quick.
That's how I was like going through my mom's old records with like Ohio Players and Brothers Johnson and all that good stuff. Definitely.
That was some dope funk.
Oh man, you know, my parents come up in that generation of funk, and if you think about disco, especially the Nile Rodgers iteration of disco, that era, those guys were trying to make kind of proggy technical funk. That it definitely attacks the one, but in a different way. Maybe a little more four on the flourish, and you don't get four on the floor. It's like, right?
That's disco. That's disco exactly. That's the dance tempo.
And you get more of that. You definitely can get that in Parliament Funkadelic. You definitely can get that in parts of Rick James. They definitely have four on the floor elements, but it is especially Parliament and even the other bigger bands of that era, like Ohio Players and Confunction and all those other bands. They're just a lot looser because those guys also come from jazz.
That's an
So
interesting point. I've never heard anyone make that point before.
so when you get to the Nile Rodgers era of disco, which is also, you know, I think sometimes when we look back at these moments, we kind of underplay the influence that drugs have in genres.
Oh, you
So,
know that nose candy was
oh
big.
yeah, you think of and it's not like those cats weren't doing the same drugs. It was just kind of a lot more of, you know, quaaludes and heroin with your crack. So when you look at, you know, the heavy cocaine years of the 70s and you look at, you know, guys like Nile Rodgers, I really, really appreciate what he did because I was at a Coachella one year and Nile Rodgers was there. And I remember I was fixing something in the beer garden and I wasn't too far off from the stage he was playing at. And then I went into, there's only one place where there's a standalone bathroom in Coachella, by the way, and it's closed to the public. And I know the guy that runs the area, and so I'll go in there. That's the one place I could use the bathroom and like hide. And they were playing on the screen Nile Rodgers' performance, and I sat there and watched his entire performance. And for like an hour, he played hits. He rocked a crowd full of people that could have been his grandchildren, playing nothing but hits that came out decades before they were born. And that just kind of blew me away. And there's a few times I've seen Coachellas where older artists have come in and really.
My favorite Chic song is not the one that people think it would. Everybody dance. Ooh, clap your hands. Clap your hands. Everybody dance. Ooh, clap your hands. Clap your. That joint is hot. That's a hot cut.
Well, let me pivot quickly to ruin Pascal's high because we have a new segment on this show. I just cut a clip. So I've been cutting clips yesterday. So if you guys are subscribe to the channel so you can see the clips of this show. These shows are so damn long. Don't you just want a little clippable bit? Just the good stuff? The icing. I'm giving you the icing. Anyway, Pascal, 2 weeks ago, gone 3 weeks ago, had given his take on Ketanji Brown Jackson 2 weeks before. A lot of people were commenting on her, kind of with opinions that I felt were a little
Shallow.
That's an understatement. I don't know if I have words in my head right now to really explain some of the opinions that I saw. Contrarian. At best, they were simply contrarian for contrarian's sake. And they weren't rooted in any sort of fact or research. And Pascal, because he comes from law, and he was very interested in the pick, did some deep dive Pascal research, and gave a great take. And that is a clip that's going right now. It's doing very well for us as far as clips go. That being said, a cringy clip that I saw as I was putting as I'm putting other clips of Pascal together and Marcus. Oh yeah, I definitely clipped a few Saturdays ago because that might have been the funniest thing we've ever. I was laughing, so I had tears coming out of my eyes. So as I'm clipping it in the background on my iPad, I'm just playing whatever on YouTube, and this clip came up, and I was like, I have to play this for Pascal because I need to see what he has to say, especially considering our show we did with Corey Robinson recently. So here we go. Pascal, be prepared.
So as we get into that, these very simply stated questions do not require overthinking. So I suppose another question here, though, is where does this come from? Well, KBJ, Ketanji Brown Jackson, is what your country looks like on critical race theory.
Oh, wow.
KBJ is your country on CRT. KBJ, Ketanji Brown Jackson, is an embodiment of the tyranny that we currently live under.
Huh.
She's an ideological, unintelligent, yet confident fanatic who is so dismissive that you might even ask the question of what a woman is.
What?
And so when she
God damn.
Pascal?
I mean, that's really like straight up. I mean, this woman intellectually could blow him away like at the drop of a dime. I mean, that's a pretty racist statement to say. Why is she unintelligent? What's unintelligent about her?
I'm trying to figure out that she is what the country looks like on critical race theory.
I mean, I mean, listen, I made a statement on the social medias. If there's any, and this is maybe I'm starting to really agree with Corey Robin on this. If there's any sign of how weak the right is, it's that they're terrified by such a totally feckless set of liberals and leftists that we have today. I mean, because we are on the left, and because we also know the liberals, all three of us know how absolutely weak as baby shit liberals and the left are. The fact that these reactionary right wingers are so terrified of this piss poor iteration of the left and of liberals, it basically tells me that they are weakest. They are really a bunch of soft, like overgrown incel, tiny weenie, like go home and cry because your wife has got you cucked.
Well, before we start calling people names,
I mean, but is this not though just is this not just the cycle of what the right does, of just like they just saying whatever they absolutely fucking can as long as they don't get and this is the thing, it's like they get booted off a platform, they cry censorship, they get more money, they say shit and it's not censored, people get pissed off and then they get more money, and then but the thing is too is that like what's bad is that I mean with CRT is like we saw that was always nothing. Did that stop people from hounding, the school boards and all that type of shit? So that's where like some of this shit is just them throwing it out. But sometimes when it sticks, even if it's off nothing, they can still have real world ramifications.
That was the one interesting thing I saw about that whole the little bit I watched the hearings. I'm not going to sit here and lie and say I watched all the hearings. I didn't watch the hearings. I watched very little bits of it. Pascal would send some clips here and there of it, and I watched those clips. But when she took that gauntlet from the right, they really were just trying to, portray her as this uber leftist. And this is what happens when you put socialism into the Supreme Court, because she's not going to protect the country. She's soft on crime. She loves child molesters. She doesn't know about gender. Like every fear mongering tactic that goes back to the McCarthy era, they rolled out for this woman, which I found interesting because we didn't see anything like that for Amy Coney Barrett. And
well, the thing that's like too is that it's a pick replacing a liberal judge. Now, I would expect this. See, this is the thing too. It's like where they might be, playing their card too early. Who knows if Clarence Thomas has an RBG moment, But like if that happens before election time, whatever's happening now, I hope they just repeat it, because my fear is though if there's an RBG moment on the other side, these motherfuckers are gonna lose their minds.
they're losing. It's an inch. It really goes to speak to, again, that's why I wanted to play it, because I think it really speaks to what we were talking about with Corey Robin about how weak the right really is and how they double down on this shit. But I think the one thing that they do be better than the oppositional party, whatever you want to call that, is they can throw a lot of shit on a wall and see what sticks at once. They have like a machine gun of shit to throw on a wall.
I mean, the thing is, though, right, is that we didn't really get into this with Corey, but I think we can say is that the notion that America is a center-right party is a lie. It's not a center-right party. It's a right-wing country. I want to be a right-wing country. America's because if we acknowledge, right, that the New Deal is an aberration in American political history, the New Deal Civil Rights Coalition, if you will, is an aberration. And everything after that, the 50-plus year counter-revolution, is a counter-revolution to that 30. We're talking about from 1945 to 1971, right? So we're talking about like literally less than a 30-year period. Well, actually, from 35 to 75, let's say 40-year period of an aberration politically. What that basically means is that no, America is not a center-right country. This is a right-wing, reactionary, conservative country. And I think that when we are watching this Supreme Court nomination process, the true nature of what America is politically is coming through. Ketanji Brown Jackson is a liberal. She is maybe a slightly progressive liberal. This woman is not a socialist. She's not a Marxist. She doesn't challenge capitalism. Basically, she has a liberal, progressive criminal justice posture on sentencing, and she's worked as a federal defense attorney, and she's had a kind of liberal, progressive caseload on various jurisprudential questions, but she's not remotely radical.
Yeah, and this is the thing, like within that, like there's like these few things, right? You got the crime bill, you've got the mass incarceration explosion. There has been a very small, right, and this is like within the neoliberal project, is like they will give small reforms, and Ketanji Brown is completely seated in the reform side of mass incarceration, in which case Congress themselves passed laws saying that judges now have a little bit more wiggle room in order to decrease, the prison population and all of these things. She is completely seated in that, but that's the thing, is like this is it goes to the whole ratchet effect, right? Where something that should be completely normal is seen as some type of, crime against our nation. And, then the, Democrats, which it seems like they're going to hold on on her pick, but in in so many other ways, Democrats are going to capitulate when it comes to actual just, policing laws. So, I mean, yeah, I don't know. This is just them doing what they do, right? If every single chance they can, they're going to try and drive their narrative.
Let me make this clear, though, right? Because the sad reality, we talked about this on the other show, on our Thursday show with the Cuba Roundup. Because the Democratic Party has lost such absolute legitimacy in certain segments of the Black community, i.e. under 40, i.e. working class Black people, no one understands or is remotely interested, barring Black petite bourgeois, middle class, upper middle class types, professional types, the Black PMC. No one is remotely energized to defend this woman, except Black people who are her class cohort. All right? Of course, we know Black people who are her class cohort
Kate Hive
are also the ones who control the ideological superstructure of Black politics, and also the ones that are loudest on various iterations of social media. Right? Are there working class Black people like, oh, that's nice, that's a Black girl, that's fine. But what I'm saying is that I haven't seen much discourse. I was watching Roland Martin the other night talking about this. I haven't seen much discourse explaining why this woman is probably the best Supreme Court pick relative to issues dealing with Black community concerns at a grassroots level that we've had since Thurgood Marshall.
Well, there's a low bar with that.
There's a low bar, but what is fascinating is that the bar is so low that the right-wing senators that we have are responding literally as if this woman was like Marx with a JD from Harvard.
You didn't know that she's the spook who sat by the door? That's the whole like, duh. You showed the movie. I don't know why you don't get it. But thank you guys for that, for taking the time to indulge me on that trigger warning. But let's bring in our guest. Today, we're going to talk about a genre that is extremely near and dear to the hearts of both Pascal and I. While his attachment may be visceral and sentimental, there is a large imprint this music has on my DNA in what I created with Bitter Lake and my previous band, Le Fin Absolute du Monde. We're going to be talking about house music, its origins as a unifying force for cis and gay Black males in a deindustrialized Detroit, to a drug music phenomenon in the UK that was almost outlawed. We constantly ask the question if music has a revolutionary potential. Did house and rave music possess that at one time? Or was it just on the wrong end of a right-dominated anti-political culture war and war on drugs era music? Our guest, Jeremiah McAllister, is a veteran in the house music scene, having worked with its founding fathers as a keyboard player and producer. Please welcome our guest, who is having camera problems, but we'll be able to hear him, Jeremiah McAllister.
How you brothers doing? Can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine.
I'm good. All right, cool. Perfect. Sorry about the camera difficulties. But I've enjoyed listening to what you guys are talking about because it's just funny because house music actually grew out of, I mean, we know about the whole disco demolition incident. That was a reaction against house disco, basically. Disco was, if you look at how the culture was moving, like you were talking about Nile Rodgers and stuff like that before. I don't know how much I should go into the history of how the music has evolved, but disco actually came from an Africanization of the music. It's like, remember in the 70s where there was all the stuff about roots and everything, how they were trying to get back into everything. Disco actually came about because Black folks, especially jazz musicians, kind of realized that we had been so stripped of our culture here in America. When the slaves were brought over from Europe, North America, they stripped us of everything. They would not let us keep any of our culture. But in the Caribbean and South America, we were allowed to keep some of the drums, some of the things there. And some of the jazz musicians in the 60s, like Dizzy Gillespie, was really big on this. They started like trying to get into their roots, and they started like exploring that whole thing about the musical culture and everything. And that's when we had this big rush of Latin jazz in the US in the 60s. If you look at the jazz period in the 60s, you'll see that's when bossa nova came in and everything else. That actually came in because
that's also when Miles starts working with electric instruments for the first time and really turning jazz into something really funky, I think, with like Bishop's Brew and stuff.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of stories behind that too.
Don't say that to what's my man's name who died recently, the journalist
James Mtume?
No, Mtume would agree with that. The guy who
was part of this. Oh, you mean Stanley Crouch?
Stanley Crouch. You know, Stanley Crouch was trying to destroy.
Oh yeah, Crouch was yeah. But I mean, Miles is a hero of mine, so believe me, I get into that. But but the thing is that when that music started, that's when we started using drums, the congas, bongos. That actually is what started that. And when you started mixing that with soul music, like Pascal, I heard you talk before about being a fan of the Philly sound and stuff like that. You know, it's like when you think about that, listen to that music. When we started using the congas and bongos and soul music, we started making this music that was kind of like uplifting. It was like that's what disco comes from. It's taking that R&B and soul and starting adding back the African culture into it in a way, you know. And I'm sorry, go ahead. You were going to say something?
Jeremiah, you got all kinds of synapses going off in my mind here. So what you're saying, right? This is some fascinating stuff. Don't think I've ever heard this framed that way. Is that disco is a product of the cultural nationalist turn that exists in Black politics starting in the late 60s.
Yes. And it's funny because I've been listening to you talk about Black nationalism the last couple of episodes, and I've been thinking about that whole framing. Yes, that's what happened, you know. And it's like as we tried to move back into it, as we started, appropriating the music, well, not appropriating so much, but bringing that culture back in. Like I said, using the drums, the congas, and the bongos, that rhythm back in the music. That's where disco actually comes from. I mean, you look at the Philly sound. That's what we had with that music. We talked about Teddy Pendergrass, and other artists like that. They were using that, and that's what changed the genre. It started taking soul in a whole different direction.
Jeremiah, you man. You're doing great, but you're moving so fast, man. I want to slow it down. You're gonna be here for a while, man.
Okay.
Let's start.
Okay.
I want to talk about the political economy of urban Black life and how it correlates with the pivot to disco and house. Let me break it down like this. We often hear about the Great Migration, the period of Black migration from the South to northern cities, Chicago, Harlem, New York, even to the West as well, particularly Chicago, New York, Detroit, particularly. This phenomenon is usually discussed in a period of time between 1910 to 1950.
Right.
What a lot of people don't often talk about is the second Great Migration. There was another Great Migration that starts in the 1940s that goes into the 1960s of Blacks leaving the South, moving into the North, because what's happening is starting in the 1930s and 40s, because of technology, sharecropper labor starts to become obsolete in the South. Right? You have Black folk starting to move up in large numbers in the 50s and 60s. But what ends up happening, as this correlates with the civil rights movement, right? People don't know deindustrialization is starting in the 50s. Why? Because as white workers are moving out to the suburbs because of the expanding of interstate highways and real estate development because of the New Deal, factories are starting to leave the major cities and move out to the suburbs. And because black people can't buy those houses, they're trapped in cities where those jobs don't exist anymore. And that's why we start to see a rise in urban crime in the 60s.
And you know, it's the way I see it too. It's like you look at the disco scene may have been like a pressure valve for the black community. You know, it's like it's like the music was an outlet. It was like, you know, when we're dealing with this, you know, the BS in the factories and everything else, there was that sense of community that you would get hanging out in the clubs together, basically.
Well, this is the thing, though. This is where I wanted to take it, though. Disco is also the first black musical iteration born in neoliberalism.
Yeah, it could be said that.
It's an amazing point.
It could be said.
Go ahead, Jeremiah. No, I'm sorry, Jeremiah. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, yeah, that could be said. I mean, I think to some extent, I usually connected more with, like I said, the jazz musicians who may have been more attached to that. I mean, because a lot of the jazz guys, to some extent, may be considered like in that vein, you know, the upper class. I mean, guys who, if you go back to jazz, the difference between jazz and blues, when jazz started, it was like the blacks who were moving into the middle class. You know, you look at blues started in this country. You had the black middle class started, and black people started teaching their kids piano lessons. They started doing classical music and things like that. Now, some of these kids, when they grew up, they started going back to the juke joints, you know, and hanging with, you know, in the brothels, and started playing music with the people there. And the music standard at the time may have been blues, but then they started mixing a little bit of what they learned, classical music and things there, into what they were playing, making the music more complex. And then that is what jazz came out of. And to some extent, I guess you could say with disco, the way I see it is that it was something that grew, it was going that way, because like when you were talking about chic earlier, there was a movement to kind of, I mean, chic in itself, the whole concept, if you look at that, they were trying to like clean themselves up in a way. It's like, we are chic, we're black, we're not necessarily street hood or something like that. There's more to black people than this, you know, the typical street stuff. We're chic. We're, you know, we have high level ideas, whatever, however you want to put
We're
it.
smart musicians.
Right, exactly.
That's what I felt that music was. It was proggy funk. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. It was progressive funk. It was just like I said, it's like, take it to the next level. Let's show more to this than just the funk. Take the funk, add our complexity to it.
But the thing is, though, we're going to talk about disco. Let's talk about what's the precursor to disco. What gives birth to disco? Hi-fi soul music of the 70s.
Yeah. And like I said, when they started trying to add some of the Afro-Caribbean rhythms, Afro-Latin rhythms into the music, the soul of that time, that's what disco came out of. It was just like, it was sort of like a different part of the genre. You know, it was just like there was soul music, but then they started saying, okay, we're going to make these tracks with some congas and some bongos, and those rhythms that they would take the traditional Afro-Latin rhythms and build on top of that, but put soul music on top of it. It's like somebody mentioned South Soul as being a record label that was quintessential for disco. The whole thing is salsa soul. That's what South Soul comes from. It's like a mixture of salsa. Sorry. It's like the mixture of salsa and soul.
Well, let's not forget, disco pretty much gets born in New York City. It starts in New York City, it goes to Philly as well. So to your larger point, the presence of the Afro-Latino urban phenomenon in New York has a lot of influence
Yes.
in post-civil rights black music, disco, house, and hip hop.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? So we
Yeah.
see this confluence. But the thing about what I want to get to the political economy, right? What's really important for me is that when this is happening, New York City is broke,
Yeah.
destitute, right? You have
Yep.
all of these people of all these quote unquote minorities, blacks, Latinos, all of them who are newly beneficiaries of the civil rights movement, right?
Yeah.
After the assassinations of COINTELPRO, after the riots and the rebellions, you start to see phenomenon like Soul Train and all that stuff. You also still have that kind of cultural nationalism. That's still around. People wearing dashikis and
Right.
getting back to the drums.
Right.
Let's not forget the role of the Black Arts Movement. We have to do a whole show on the Black Arts Movement.
Yes.
The Black Arts Movement that comes out of the 70s with the poets, Amiri Baraka, all of that stuff.
Yes.
In that cultural milieu.
Gil Scott Heron.
A whole kind of
so true. You said Gil Scott Heron.
Gil Scott Heron, you know what I'm saying? You got Gil Scott Heron, Nikki Giovanni, you got
Audre Lorde.
I can't believe the Revolution will not be the brothers who are like
The Last Poets. Audre Lorde.
That whole vibe.
And that's
the Black Arts Movement. All of that is going on. All of this cultural kind of manifestation of Black social activity is coming about, where at the same time, the actual politics of the movement is dissipating.
Okay. That, I am not as good at speaking to that part of the politics with this, but I do look at it like with that movement, it started with some of those things, like you're saying, like I was saying, Gil Scott Heron. We were talking about the music. If you listen to his album, It's Your World, that can be one of the building blocks of disco. I mean, there's actually so many house music songs that sampled from that album.
Say it again for the people in the back. Gil Scott Heron is a legend in house music.
Yes, because he was the one. I mean, and you can hear him, like he talks about on that album, you can hear him talking about the guaguancó, where he's actually talking about using Afro-Caribbean rhythm in the music, and he's one of the people that really put that in there. And the thing I would say is that how disco got off the rails and turned into this whole disco sucks movement is that you had the usual appropriation in American culture. You had the blacks doing something that culturally they were, I mean, like I said, it may have been a pressure valve release where we had these discos, these clubs we could go to hang out and listen to this music and, feel a certain sense of freedom. And it was almost like white people came to these clubs and like, oh, wow, you black people, you've got something great going on here. This is, this music is great. We feel really free listening to it, and it was just like they took that and that's when it started becoming the popular disco movement.
Well, can we add this, Jeremiah? Can we add this caveat to what you're explaining about the freedom, though, of disco, and then what I really want to get into, but the freedom of the genre that you came up with, house. There's a lot to be said about Black people and their relationship with homosexuality, the LGBTQ community, or however you want to put it. Especially when you look back, we were talking about this also recently with Corey Robin. You look back at, I think it was Proposition 8 to legalize the gay marriage vote. There was a big backlash because there was a large contingent of Black people that voted to keep gay marriage illegal. But when you think about disco music and you think about even house music, kind of the first images that come into my head are gay Black men.
You got to look at the evolution of like how the house music scene started, because like I heard you guys talking before about the disco demolition. that happened in Comiskey Park in Chicago.
Yes.
You got to look at that. That was a backlash against this culture that I'm talking about. It's like it started dominating. It started dominating American culture. I mean, pop music. All these radio stations that were rock at one time started playing disco. There was something to this music that started dominating the pop scene, and you had the backlash of somebody like Steve Dahl on that radio station. He had gotten fired from a station because he didn't want to play disco. He wanted to keep playing, 70s rock and stuff like that. But they were pushing him to play disco because that was becoming popular. And you had this big backlash among some people, among some cis white males, basically, we could say, that didn't get into this disco culture. I mean, they hated going to the clubs because their girlfriends would end up dancing with a black guy all night, something like that. And so there was this backlash against the music, and it worked actually, because I mean, really, the whole disco sucks thing, it became this big thing, and overnight almost, disco was done. It was like I mean, there's artists that I've worked with who were getting popular at that time, who their careers kind of just fell apart because there was this whole backlash against this disco movement. But then hip hop started growing out of New York, so it was just kind of like, okay, go there, let's go to hip hop, or the new wave British thing was coming on, and there was there was that. But in Chicago, like you mentioned before, the sound really did come out of New York and Philly. But in Chicago, we were trying to keep it alive. We were like, there's something to this music. We can't just say disco sucks and dismiss this music that we like. You can't get rid of it, and we can stop playing in the clubs. Now, the clubs that started playing it first, that kept it going, were the gay clubs. That's where that comes in. Is that the gay clubs like Frankie Knuckles and Ron Hardy, the clubs that they played in were basically gay clubs. But you had a lot of straight people, the more that would go there. You had a lot more of the artistic black types, the bohos, whatever they would call it, that would go and hang out. And that's the house music scene actually comes from that. So the gay clubs kept the music alive. And even the term house music kind of comes from that, because the Warehouse was the big gay club. That was Frankie Knuckles' club in Chicago. And when there was the backlash against disco, a lot of the DJs at clubs outside, other parts of the city, they stopped playing disco, and they tried to go back to funk or whatever else was being played on the radio at the time. And but some of us, high school kids like me, would say, we would say, no, we don't want to hear that. Can we keep hearing the disco stuff we like, the South Soul stuff, the Philly stuff? We wanted to keep hearing that. And the term house comes from, we would say, can you play some music like they play at the Warehouse? Can you play some house music? And that was where we got the term, was that, it's like we're saying we wanted to keep hearing that disco music. We wanted to keep hearing that. Now, when we eventually started making our own music, and there's a documentary I actually sent to you guys and posted in your chat that really covers this, in your Discord, that really covers this. When we started making our own music, that is actually what house turned into. But it actually was parallel to hip hop. It was like we were working at the same time. Hip hop, actually, we were using the same drum machines, the same synthesizers as hip hop guys were using. But they were taking funk tracks. It's like Kool Herc would talk about, they call them B-boys because they like certain breaks. They like the breaks in the hip hop records. And he would just play the breaks, and the B-boys was break boys because that was the thing that they liked. Well, hip hop took like these funk breaks. House took the disco breaks, and we built on top of that. And like, I'm associated with Steve Hurley, and Farley.
Steve Silk Hurley,
yeah. And Farley, Jack Master Funk.
Jack your body, Jack.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I worked with Steve for years, and that was the first house song to go #1 in the UK. So that kicked off a whole lot of things, you know.
All right, listen, man, Jeremiah, you doing so good, but you going so fast, bro. Pause.
Hey, jump in. I know.
But well, we're gonna get into the debate of the debates. Let's get to the crux right now. Where does house music start? Does it start in Chicago? Does it start in Detroit? Does it start in New York? Because some people say Larry Levan creates it when he's DJing at the clubhouse in Chicago, but Larry Levan was in New York before he moved to Chicago.
Larry and Frankie Knuckles were actually best friends. Larry was DJing at the Paradise Garage in New York.
Correct.
And when you talk about garage, it's like that's their term. It's another term for house music, but they're saying house with a little more soul to it. It's like that's what garage kind of means. It's like it's the music they're saying kind of grows more out of what Larry was doing at the Paradise Garage.
Correct.
Frankie was brought to Chicago by a guy who had been in New York. Funny thing, I think he was a corrections officer, and he moved here to Chicago. He was a gay guy, and he ran clubs in New York, and he started doing the same thing in Chicago. And he basically brought Frankie in to try to bring the vibe to Chicago. So it was based off of what Larry was doing, and a lot of times Frankie was playing right, and Frankie was playing the stuff that Larry would give him, you know, to the Chicago audience, you know. So there is that connection. I mean, I think the New York, there has always been this kind of you know, this tension between, well, did house really come from Chicago or New York? And a lot of the disco music that we were listening to did come from New York and Philly. But I think the whole thing is that Chicago tried to keep the disco alive, whereas in New York, they started moving towards hip hop. It was that the money was there. I mean, Russell Simmons was a disco head. You know, he was hanging in the club. If he had grown up in Chicago, he would have been in the house music. But there was the opportunity there to make money in the hip hop genre. You know, I mean, Queen Latifah, my first remix I played on was a Queen Latifah remix, a song called Come Into My House. And there was still that mix between house and disco. House and R&B. You know, there was still, the genres had not split. There was still this thing where you go to the club and you hear some R&B and you hear some disco. But then when the whole backlash against disco started, a lot of people did not want to play the disco as much, you know, and house was kind of a reaction against that. It was like, no, let's keep this alive. And in Chicago, I think we did a better job of keeping that alive. And then when we started making our own music, that's when it really started blowing up. That's when it started going over to the UK. And so Chicago was credited for creating house music. But there were guys in New York and Jersey who were doing it too.
Ali US comes out of Jersey, big house group.
The Follow Me.
Follow me.
Yeah,
Follow
yeah.
me.
Yep, exactly.
I have a question though of if you could get into a little bit about like what it actually means for like the house musicians to be like making their own music. Using, you know, like you want to go into like just even like some like the drum machine and just using, you know, laying over their own samples they created. But what did that do for house?
It just took it to the next step to where you weren't just playing disco in the club anymore. You know, it was like we were actually starting to make the music. Like Steve Hurley, the Jack Your Body song, that is actually a break song. Basically, it's based on an old South Soul song called "Let No Man Put Us Under." And there was a break in the song that people loved. I mean, you could play that whole break all night in the club, would dance to it. He took that break and recreated it using the 808 drum machine, same things the hip hop guys were using, and keyboards, you know, like the Juno and you know, same kind of technology they were using. Yes. And he created that track using that. And
Can we
so
talk?
it's like you're taking the genre, and now we're starting to make our own music rather than just playing the disco or sampling the disco.
Can we
So,
talk a little bit about the 808? Because the 808, I think,
yep.
is a game changer in Black music,
Yes.
especially when we start talking about how music programs are starting to be cut in public
Yep.
education. If we look at the early iterations of funk, a lot of these guys learn how to play instruments in school.
Yeah.
And by the time we get down to now, like the 80s and the latter 70s, as so many public schools are getting every program cut, no one knows how to play instruments except for the church kids, which I think is why gospel is so prevalent in house music, because you still have people that grew up going to church, and there's a few cats that know how to play the keyboards. If you told me, Jeremiah, that you learned how to play the keyboard in church, I would not be surprised.
You know, ironically, my grandfather is a preacher. I grew up in church.
There's a heavy gospel influence on the music, especially when it comes to the female vocals later on. But
Kojic, as a matter of fact.
my brother. Say no more, my brother.
So you and Jason know about those 12-hour long church services.
Oh yeah.
Just ruining football. Well, my grandfather was a bishop of several churches throughout Northern California. So as a kid, I got to get out of school to go to the conventions, the big conventions.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Yep.
When I was a little boy. But
Church of God in Christ convention.
The 808 is a game changer, because you now no longer have to get your 5 friends in a garage making a lot of noise. You get a pair of headphones or maybe some some speakers.
Yep.
And you can create every instrument. A bass line, like Planet Rock's bass line, is not doom 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 doom. It's meow meow meow. You know.
I mean, explain to the audience what an 808 is. A lot of us.
Sorry about that. Sorry, Jeremiah. Yeah, explain the 808 for us, brother.
808 was a drum machine made by a Japanese company called Roland. And it was like, and there's a great documentary about this. Actually, you can find it. There's a whole documentary about the 808. 808, like Jason was saying, it was designed to be an accompaniment instrument for somebody that might be like, you might go in one of these lounges and you'd see the keyboard player playing, and you would hear this cheesy drum pattern going with it while he was playing. It was like, that was what it was actually originally designed to do. But the Black community, hip hop and house community at the time, took that drum machine and turned it into the centerpiece of the music. Like he was talking about Planet Rock. I mean, that really triggered it. It became seminal in hip hop. The 808 drum machine, that boom of the kick drum. Now there were other Roland drum machines also. There was a 909, and actually the 909 was a little bit more popular for house music. And then there was a bass machine called the 303 that was used, and that was actually was used to create acid house, because it was like that was used to actually make bass patterns. The others were just drums. You could get the drum sounds, but the 303 actually you could make a bass line pattern. But the thing is, it had filters and things and envelopes that you could actually change on there. And actually, in the documentary about house music, Pump Up the Volume, the one I sent you guys, you could see how it was created. DJ Pierre talks about how him and the guy, they were trying to make a track with like an 808 and this 303, and they had this bass line going, and they started playing with the knobs. And when they started realizing the change of the sound, this whole thing, that was what it came out of. That's where acid house actually came up from.
Yeah. And I still love. I'm 44 years old, and I still love arpeggiated synthesizers.
This is something too that, like, I think is kind of interesting that maybe can be flipped to now, is that the available technology to make music, but then also like a kind of like a radical behavior of not saying what was this machine made to do, but
Right.
what type of music
What
can
we
I
gonna do
make?
with it?
Yeah.
Right.
So,
Right.
and actually tell, cause I'm kind of interested of like, A, how much did this shit cost? You know,
Well,
what
it
was
was
it like trying to buy some of this stuff, some of this new equipment? And I guess what is the affordability
it
to
was
some of this stuff allow really that explosion to actually happen because more people could make music?
that's actually kind of interesting because I think that um it was not cheap. It's a funny thing. I remember the 808, and I remember like my brother got my mother to buy him an 808, and I remember that it would cost like about $800. And I remember that because it was like the 808 and it was $800, you know. But the that probably for a lot of black folks that was not, you could not afford that at the time. I mean, my mother had pretty good job. We were pretty much in the middle, lower middle class, so we had a little extra money at the time, and so she could afford to do that for us for Christmas. But you would have that where you would have some, like a lot of us pulled our instruments together. It's like my brother had the 808. I had another friend of my brother's, excuse me, who bought a 4-track recording machine, and we would all kind of get together and work together to put, the music together to do our demos, basically. And I mean, it's a similar story that you can see. The same thing happened in New York with hip hop. It was like there were similar things that happened. Its house was just like, instead of taking the funk, we were keeping the disco alive. I mean, it's really almost that simple. So,
So what's really interesting, man, is that we're talking about the technological ways in which you help manifest the creation of this actual form of music.
mm,
What's interesting to me, right, is that what are the demographics of the crowds that are going to these these clubs, right? Because I know in New York, when I was at the house scene, yeah, definitely there were definitely a lot of gay brothers and sisters, right? There were a
mhm,
lot of black men and women, a lot of Latinos, but
right.
you would see like working class whites, slightly upscale whites as well. And you'd be like, well, okay, this is interesting. But
Yeah.
and also, what you would see a lot of the kind of bohemian art set. You would see
Yes.
a lot of those kids in that scene, very
Yes.
much so.
Yes. And that was a big part of it. I mean, a lot of the black kids that that would go to the gay clubs, that were like, felt like it was cool to go, were
Mhm.
part of that. They were part of the whole bohemian art aesthetic, kind of. It's like they thought it was cool. We thought it was cool to go to these gay clubs. You know, and we would go there, hear the music, and say, yeah, this is what we want to keep playing. We want to hear this. And like I said, so across Chicago, you would hear, people would have tapes from the clubs, like Frankie tapes or Ron tapes, and playing them around the city. And I guess, but going back to the demographics, like you were saying, I mean, yeah, if you went to those clubs, you had people from all over. It was like you'd see, class was hard to tell in there. It was just a bunch of people having fun together. But you would kind of see it. You'd see these white people there that you were like, oh, this looks like some kind of day trader that showed up here or something like that, or it was definitely a mixture.
So do you feel it was a unifying force, the music in the city at the time? Because you're talking about another city that's starting to deal with some deindustrialization hardcore as well.
What, with Detroit?
Yeah.
Um, Actually, it's interesting because if you look, some of the Detroit started because some of those guys would come to Chicago and party here,
Mm-hmm.
and then they started doing the same thing in Detroit. Derek May is one of the gods of techno music, as they would say. He, when you hear him talk about, he will mention a lot about how he came to Chicago and went to the warehouse and went to the music box where Ron Hardy would spin, and just how that influenced him, how hearing that music influenced what he was doing. But then they took it to a different level there. Um, Derek likes to describe it like, when he tried to do house music, it was like if you put Kraftwerk and George Clinton in an elevator
Mm.
and then close it up and then open it up later, and what would come out of that, was what he was going for when it came to, techno music of Detroit. There was this whole aesthetic of, you know, the blighted urban landscape. There was that whole, um, I guess you would say, artistic aesthetic that they were going for with some of that.
And for me also, because I come from heavy music,
Mhm.
you get kind of around the same time the birth of industrial music that also
Oh,
is heavy on the 808. One of the kind of early people in industrial metal, Justin Broderick from Godflesh, took
mhm.
me out on tour, and that was definitely a kind of a life-changing experience. But getting
I used
getting to
to.
tour with a bit of a legend like that is dope.
I actually used to work a lot in the studio with Farley, Jack Master Funk,
Hmm.
and there's one famous studio in Chicago, Chicago Tracks,
Hmm.
and that was where you had, who's the guy that produced Nirvana from here? I forgot his name.
Oh, Steve Albini.
Albini, yes,
Yeah,
Albini would work there. I met him there. Al Jorgensen from Ministry.
yeah.
A lot of times Jorgensen and Ministry would be in Studio A while I was in Studio B with Farley. You know.
That's nuts, man. That's nuts. For those that don't know, Ministry is also one of those early industrial bands in the same vein, like a heavier Nine Inch Nails, if you're not familiar with them. But they come
Yeah.
from dance music. So Wax
Yes.
Tracks had bands like Ministry, My Life with the Thrill Kill
Because you'll kill
Cult.
Colt. Right. Yep.
Oh, some of the European groups. Was KMFDM on Wax Tracks? I don't remember. I'll have to look it up. But
Actually, Thrill
go
Kill, there was a singer that sang backgrounds with them, a woman named Shay Jones.
ahead. Hmm.
And we actually ended up doing a track on her that ended up being a real big hit in the UK. So there was a lot of crossover between the industrial and the house scene. I mean, there were some industrial guys that would, on the low, would actually make house tracks and put them out under different names on the house music labels. So there was a lot of crossover between us.
Because it's that same four on the floor. We're using the same
Exactly.
equipment. It's
Exactly.
just I'm gonna throw a guitar over it opposed to a piano, right?
Exactly. I mean, and that's what it comes down to. It's like the music you're putting over it. I
Right.
mean, like right now we have EDM going,
Hmm.
and some people would say, well, what's the difference between house and EDM? You know, Actually, I would kind of sometimes I would make the joke. It's like, well, play the music in front of a crowd of black people and a crowd of white people.
I actually want to, you
If the
move
black
back
people
then.
dance, that's house music.
EDM is electronic dance music.
Damn. There's a lot of truth in that, man. That's hilarious.
Well, I wanted to get to that evolution, right? From
Mhm,
techno to
mhm.
electronica or electronic dance music,
Yeah.
and the kind of changing of the guard of the racial makeup of the producers of this music, as well as the increase in the monetization for those
Yeah.
who are producing it. I want to
Yep.
get there, but let's
Mhm,
talk specifically
mhm.
about the Detroit sound.
Okay.
How do you distinguish Detroit house music from Chicago house music, from New York house music, from Baltimore house music?
Um, New York house music, like in UK, they actually like to call that more garage
Garage.
because we're garage. Yeah, garage. I'm using the British term, but
In it.
garage. Yeah, but they like calling it that because, and to some extent, New York was the original home of that disco sound. So the house music that kind of keeps that disco-ish sound is usually associated more with that, with garage. That is the difference. Chicago house music, it's like we took that same concept, but we kind of stripped it down a little bit, and it was more electronic focus. It was more, you know, synthesizers more so than the live instruments. Then Detroit, but Chicago still had an emphasis on the soul music side of it, the still sound of making it still sound like soul music. The chords and everything were still that way. Detroit was kind of like they took the whole industrial thing. And they were like, well, we're going to take this in a whole different direction. We're going to, you know, not just stick to the traditional, keyboard sounds and everything else. We're going to change it up. And they started creating this uh I don't know how you I I wouldn't want to say quirky in a way, but just this different combination of the music. It was just like and a mix of soul and industrial in a way. And that was the Detroit difference.
What about Baltimore?
Baltimore, I'm not as sure as how that works because I know the thing is that in Baltimore the big scene there was the go-go. Each place had their regional differences, and go-go was a bigger thing there. So some of the house music in from Baltimore may have had more of that influence. So you would kind of see the differences like that. But
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say what you said something that's really important, and Jason definitely remembers this. I don't know Marcus might not, but we're old enough to remember when there was actually something called regional black.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I'm old enough to remember regional style.
Yes.
People don't understand that hip hop was just New York City regional black music. You had
Right.
go-go in DC, you had bass in Miami, you had house that was in New York and Chicago.
Yep.
Oakland, what was the music that was kicking in Oakland in the 80s? The black music
Rap.
that was that's true. Y'all had the rap was
Rap.
big.
I mean, funk was still a thing, though. Funk and like R&B was definitely
Yeah.
still a thing. But people have to always forget in the early 80s, radio is still split, and black music has maybe you have a hip hop station if you're in a major metropolitan area, because we still have in the early 80s, we still haven't gotten the buyout yet. Right.
Clear Channel.
The Clear Channel buyout and the deregulation hasn't happened. So you can actually have black stations that maybe play hip hop.
Yes.
Right, especially like college stations and independent stations, and you'll definitely have stations that are like, we are a black station, but we don't touch it. They didn't really start touching hip hop till the late 80s, early 90s.
Clear Channel, that whole thing that ruined it here in Chicago because they brought in program directors, that came from other places that were not into house music, and they were just like, right, and they just stopped playing it, to some extent.
And you know why that comes from them having a business model,
Yes,
that is built around knowing that music is starting to become this free thing that people don't necessarily pay for ad time. And the thing that was really selling more ad time was talking. And so when these program directors were coming in, you're right, they weren't coming in locally. And all these radio stations had a local foothold in the businesses and the community in general. So they knew what was happening. They knew who the hot artists were. You also start to see around this same time of consolidation and deregulation that local artists stop getting access to get played at any point on terrestrial radio because it's just not profitable. And instead of hitting up local businesses for ad money, because ad revenue is what keeps radio running, now you can have more national campaigns because you're running on a different kind of program schedule where you may have one guy in Wyoming that's doing all the drops, and drops are like, this is 95 the beat, your best dance and shit. Like that's the guy that's doing it for all the different stations. Or you may think that you have a radio host that goes, coming at you live from Virginia, the Washington Commanders lost again. And then he goes, to the next, coming at you live from Delaware, Joe Biden and credit cards. Like it's they'll have the regional thing, and you think this is your DJ. It really changed the way that we even consume music because it was done on a scale that a lot of people are still trying to wrap their heads around. I think,
and it even hurt house music. It even hurt house music as being recognized as a black form of music because the whole programming thing. It was just like a lot of these stations would not play house music. If there were R&B stations, it's like, no, we're only playing this stuff. You know, I mean, you played the CC Peniston finally. I actually wrote her second single, co-wrote her second single. We Got a
Off
Love
that
Thing.
same album?
Yeah, We Got a Love Thing. It was
We
the
got a
second
love
single.
thing!
Whoa, you whoa. Hold on.
Hold on! Stop the presses! Stop the presses! Stop! Wait a second. Hold on. This is
Oh, you want to hear something even crazier?
wait, Negro. Wait a minute, Negro. Wait a minute, Negro. I need you to understand this, and I will go off air because I'm going to sit here like a child and listen to this story. 1991 or 92 that album drops. 91 or 92. When is that?
92.
92. I'm home from school. I'm a freshman in high school, and I probably ditched or lied and said I was sick. I had a working mother. She could only do so much. God bless Pam Davis.
Hey,
So
the same way.
BET had some really good Black music, and they had a show called Video Vibrations, and Video Vibrations played house music that you couldn't find anywhere, and they played CC Peniston's Finally. And I was like, I don't know who this thick ass light skinned woman is singing, but all I want to hear is her sing. I took whatever money I could find in the couch and whatever I could find, because a single back then was $3.24. That's with tax, $2.99. There was a record store down the street that sadly no longer exists called Tees Wowoozy Records. I went to Tees Wowoozy and I was like, can I get, do you have Finally, CC Peniston? And I bought it and I played that shit out. And then when We Got a Love Thing, she had what, 6 or 7 singles off that record?
Actually, she only had a few off that. There was another album that was released later, and she had more singles off of that. I think she had like 4 singles off that album. Yeah.
Every single she dropped for me was like the greatest shit in the world. And I was a huge fan of ditching school and watching Video Vibrations because it definitely came on when I was supposed to be in class. And CC Peniston was like the gateway into house music for me and like my love for the genre. So now now that you know that, I will take this response off air.
So man, so you actually wrote.
Nigga, why are you talking? He's supposed to be telling the CC.
No. I'm gonna answer what he's about to say. Actually, go ahead.
so you wrote that song for CC Peniston?
Yes, I co-wrote it with a guy named Eric Miller. Eric E. Smooth Miller. The funny thing is that Eric E. Smooth Miller actually discovered Kanye West. He has a whole.
What today?
How do you say? Can you pronounce the name again? I'm not sure. I'm familiar.
Yay, I think it is.
Bro, yo, listen, Jeremiah, you dropping some major bombs.
He has a whole album that he did with Kanye. That's Kanye sued him to keep it from being released.
Oh, damn.
Are you serious? What is his brother's name that you said discovered Kanye West?
Eric Miller.
Tell him to give it to Pete Davidson. It'll drive him wild.
Tell us the story of how.
I'll send you a link. Actually, there was a story in Billboard about how Kanye sued him and everything to keep him from releasing it. I think the brother actually probably got paid to not release the album. I mean, I talk to him sometimes. He can't really, talk about what happened, but he seemed to have some money. So I think Kanye settled with him.
Hey, that's wild.
So yeah. So I'm sorry, what were you saying, Pascal?
Yeah, no, that's incredible, man. So you and the guy who discovered Kanye West wrote that song for CC Peniston.
Yes.
Through the Wire. Oh man, that was my jam.
So here's the thing, right? How many songs do you have credit for writing in terms of house cuts, Jeremiah?
Actually, to be honest, I don't have that many because the thing we did at first, actually, the reason why we wrote the song for CC or ended up being on that album, is because initially what we did was we did a lot of remixing. You know, it was like because house was growing so much in the clubs, we did a lot of house music remixes, and we got really popular with uh the a lot of the major labels. They would come to us almost every um somebody just said Solid Richardson. Oh wow. Um every every label wanted a house music mix. And working with Steve So Curly, he was the king of the remix at the time. And I basically went to work for his company. You know, I mean, I had gone to college for computer science and I had my degree. I was working as a programmer for Sears, but Steve was somebody I knew growing up and I could actually play keyboards. And Eric kind of brought me into their company saying, you know, hey, can you help me out? Let's do some stuff. And we did a lot of remixing of different records. I mean, I'm on 2 Michael Jackson records. I have my name on there, you know, remixing. And you know, there's Janet, a couple Janet Jackson. I did a remix for Madonna. You know, it's like all of those things. We did a lot of that. But the problem is that when you're doing remixing, you're not making as much money because you're not getting the publishing royalties. You're taking somebody else's song, making it better, and improving their chances of making money. But you're not actually making money. You might get 10,000 or 15,000 to do the remix, but you're helping them to because now that version may be played more than the original album version or something like that.
And
And we got the CC thing came up because we were like, wait a minute, we're losing out on this. We got to start making music. So Eric and I wrote some songs, and we started every time somebody asked us to do a remix, we would send them songs too and say, hey, but what about this for the artist? And CC's people were like, oh yeah, we like these songs, let's do them. You know, so that's how that came around.
Can you talk to us about your relationship with Frankie Knuckles?
Um, yeah. So Frankie, um, first of all, you talked about being too young to go to the discos. I heard you say that earlier.
Yeah.
I was actually too young to go to the warehouse, the original warehouse where he was. I mean, I think once when I was 13, we went and like a friend of mine who could drive went and we stood outside. But I met Frankie through the first house music label, one of the first house music labels. The first two were DJ International and Chicago Tracks. And I actually had known people that were working with Frankie. I mean, one of his engineers that was a friend of a friend. So it's like I had known him through association. But I actually ended up knowing him because he was doing an album for DJ International. He was working on an album for DJ International Records. And they put me with him because I was kind of like the new rising, you know, I was playing a lot of different people's records, you know, keyboards and stuff because I had some musical training. And there were a lot of house music guys that did not have that. So I could go in and help them, you know, figure out how to make their stuff actually sound like music. And they put me together with Frankie to work with the music there. And so I ended up doing a few tracks with him, you know. But the thing that made me like a hood legend in a way though was because when I started working with Frankie, I went by his place, and anybody that was a DJ would love to. They were like Frankie had all of these tapes that he would play in the club that he got from Larry Levan, you know, all these exclusive disco remixes and everything else. Frankie actually let me borrow his reel to reel and his tapes and take them home. And I was able to make cassette versions of everything. So that made me like a hood legend because, you know, it was like, oh man, Jerry got Frankie's stuff. He got all his tapes. And I would make these tapes. And of course, my tapes started disappearing because my friends started taking them from me. You know.
Well, you know, it's interesting, right? Because you have another aspect of your life which is fascinating that you shared with me via email, and I remember it now.
Right.
Is that you went to the same high
High
school
school
and
as
same in the
Michelle.
area as Michelle Obama?
Yes.
dun dun dun.
I actually the funny thing is that I did not know that we actually grew up on the same street until recently. I knew we were in the same area. There's an area called South Shore in Chicago where I grew up. I knew that she was in the area, but actually it was just like a year ago I heard Obama say something about she was on 74th and something. And I was just like, oh, wait a minute. I was on 74th and Phillips. It was like, and when I saw that where she grew up, it was like, that was like a mile west from where I grew up, you know. but yeah, we went to the same high school. We went to Whitney Young High School, and there was and it's really interesting because, like I said, I listen to you guys' podcast because Pascal, I love your takes on, on the politics of this, and I'm not as steeped in that. I mean, I come from more of the musical anthropology, kind of thing. But there are some interesting things about that because we both made it out of our neighborhood in a way. Like, have you guys seen the movie Finding Forrester? Are you familiar with that movie?
No.
Vaguely, I know what movie you're talking about. Yeah.
That movie
Oh
always
yes, I have seen it. Yes, I have seen it. Yes.
it fascinates me because it was directed by Gus Van Sant, but it was right after he did the movie with what's the Boston guys Good Will Hunting. Right after he did the
Damon?
movie Good Will Hunting, he went and did the same movie in a way, but now with a black character instead of the white guy. And but the story is like this kid from the hood, and Sean Connery is in it. And it's like this kid from the hood that's like, but he's actually a literary genius, basically. And that gets him out of the neighborhood. It gets him, because of his test scores, it gets him out of the neighborhood, and he gets to go to this prestigious school in Midtown Manhattan, And yeah, it was Matt Damon. But he gets to go to this prestigious school in Midtown Manhattan. And to some extent, high school I went to, Whitney Young, was sort of like that. It was where the Chicago school system was terrible at the time. And instead of fixing the schools, they made what they called a magnet school. And they decided to make one school in the center of the city and put all the best minds in there, in that one school, rather than improving the rest of the school system. So,
they're playing to school choice.
Right. And it's just, but it was like, I mean, the funny thing is at the time, not only was Michelle Obama there, another crazy thing was that the Wachowskis were there, the creators of The Matrix,
Wow.
And
what did they put in the water?
Yeah, I mean, but it was like that. But that was the thing. They just pulled all the kids that were like the crappy, so you don't have to go to your crappy school in your neighborhood. We're gonna put you all in this one school in the center of the city, And I mean, I'm sure there's some political implications of that. I'm sure, Pascal, you could get into how, what that means for the community and everything else. But it's just that was, but getting back to house music actually kind of grew out of that class in a way. It was like there was a rejection of the hip hop as it was growing. When the whole disco sucks thing happened, it was like, to some extent, my point of view as a kid in high school at the time, it was like, okay, so then radio started going back to playing certain black music that in a way we were like, oh man, but this kind of, it's like we're being taken back to the black exploitation period. We thought we were moving away from that, although there was some great music that actually influenced disco and house out of that period. But it was like with a lot of hip hop, the artists and everything, it was just like, for us, it felt like a step back in a way.
It's interesting. It's interesting that you say that, because when you think about certain hip hop groups that come out of the quote unquote golden era groups, and sorry, my camera died, so that's why you will see a picture of CeCe Peniston.
Right.
When you think about like groups like De La Soul, who talk about their trip to the UK during their early touring years, really opened them up to house music and techno music. Their second record is extreme. De La Soul is Dead is extremely influenced by house music, and to the point where they even got some backlash from it when it was released. But it also opened them up to a whole different fan base.
I mean, the thing is that culturally, when I see those brothers like De La Soul or Tribe, I'm like, if they grew up in Chicago, they would have been into house.
Oh, listen, those cats knew about house music because it was in the
city. Yeah, they do.
There.
Like I said,
they have house remixes. No, they talk about going to Europe and kind of being how blown away how large house was. So they have a song called, I think it's called like "I'll House You," and they definitely have a lot
of that was
Jungle Brothers.
Jungle Brothers.
Brothers. Exactly.
Yeah, and they have
But they were
ton of house
associated.
remixes. De La Soul.
Right. And the thing is that most of them they were listening to house at the same time. I mean, the thing is that both of these genres were developing together.
I mean,
you know,
this is why I got, because all those cats
But
are my age.
Right.
And those cats were partying in the college scene, in the club scene. You would
Right.
go to a club and you would hear house, you would hear disco, you would hear
Right.
a mix. You would be some cats. Now, I will be correct. There were some cats who were into hip hop exclusively,
Right.
and did not mess with house music.
Right.
That's true. Also, to be fair, in the New York City scene, there was a class element to house music amongst black folks.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about. But
will you admit, though, that the through line that connects house and hip hop and why De La Soul is able to do these remixes is the 808?
It wasn't so much just the technology. I mean, I think it's more of a cultural thing. I mean, it was really that when I look at somebody like De La Soul and Tribe, those brothers are probably a little bit more middle class.
Yes.
Exactly.
Very much.
And so there was this thing. It's like hip hop was like this whole, mythology of the streets and everything else. It was just, there was just this. But it was like Russell Simmons'
father was an academic.
Exactly.
In the City University system.
When hip hop becomes the soundtrack and the the approved music of black culture at large.
But why was it approved? This is what bothers me about hip hop, is that the thing is that it was not disco. It was like when white people basically decided disco sucks. Anything that sounded like disco was removed from the playlist, basically. But they were like, but we like your hip hop. We like that, and so it was like, if you look at the industry, it was just like, I mean, we would see this. It was like, if we tried to go in to take a record.
You know the reason for that, Jeremiah.
Yes, that's what I'm going at. Exactly. And it was like, because I remember seeing Ice-T on a talk show once, and they were talking to him. He was saying, look, I know what music I'm making. 60 to 80% of this music I make is bought by white kids in the suburbs. And the hip hop and house were growing at the same time, and there was a lot of the hip hop guys that were hearing, like Pascal was saying, you would hear all this different music in the club, but their professional careers, if they wanted to make music that the labels would take, they had to, stick to only a certain style. If they played anything that sounded too disco-ish, too house-ish or whatever, the label would be like, oh no, that doesn't sell. That's disco. Ugh. That kind of attitude, and so that is how I mean, well, I guess getting back to what I was saying is like the Jungle Brothers and De La Soul and Tribe, if they came up in Chicago, they would have been there. But the class element, like you said, they grew up in middle class houses. I mean, Russell Simmons, let's talk about, where I wanted to go with this. Def Jam Records.
Mm-hmm.
The funny thing is that, it's like they look at this as like, okay, yeah, Def Jam, it's black folks. Russell started this label and everything else, but it's like, no, it was Russell and two other dudes, Leor Cohen and Rick Rubin.
And Russell.
Rick Rubin, right? Rick Rubin and Leor.
The music.
Rick was making the music. The funny thing is I've talked to some people that work for Def Jam who were doing promotion here in Chicago, and Russell was known for having a bad ear. But if you look at the original thing with Def Jam Records, you remember artists like Orange Juice Jones?
Yep.
Of course. I saw
you
and her
walking in the rain.
You're holding hands and I never be the same.
Yeah, and he had another artist named Allison Williams. Russell was actually still trying to push like what he thought was real black music on that label. you know. But he had Ruben and and the other people tell him, no man, that's not what that's not what's really selling. This is what we really want. So
And
that was an
let
influence.
me add something to what you're saying, Jeremiah, to really put into perspective who Rick Rubin is. At the same time Rick Rubin is doing this at Def Jam,
Right.
he's producing Slayer's South of Heaven,
Okay. Yep.
1986.
Mm-hmm.
Same time.
Rick, as a matter of fact, Russell Simmons wanted to ding Public Enemy, and it was Rick Rubin who was like, "Yo, these guys are dope. What are you talking about?" He was like, "Nah, man."
Right. Right. I mean, well, I would say the Public Enemy. The funny thing about with house music here in Chicago is that initially we had like an aversion to hip hop because we, like I said, we felt like we could feel the whole thing. Like this is the industry trying to tell us what we should like.
Yo, let me tell you something. It's funny. It's funny you say that, Jeremiah. You know what's funny? Because a lot of people don't understand that. I remember being in law school and meeting black women from Chicago who hated hip hop music, hated it.
And it came from a cultural thing where I think here in Chicago we were like, wait a minute, they're pushing it. It's almost like we felt like they were forcing that genre on us. It's like, no, this is what you black people should like.
Yeah, a lot of people don't understand.
Which, and that's like, can we usually talk about like regional music?
Yeah.
And like when I was coming up, there was regional music, right? You had New York hip hop that was a little more raw, grimy, right? A little bit faster. And, you had the West Coast, who had a lot of funk, and then eventually Southern style rap, Master P paving the way, and then Swisher House. So, but like that's the thing is like it's all within this hip hop paradigm, and it completely erases. I mean, like by the time I'm growing up, like disco and even they turn all this stuff like EDM into like either it's for white people or it doesn't exist.
But it's all marketing, Marcus, when you think about it, because the king of
100%.
West Coast hip hop maybe is Ice Cube. His first two records, the most of the production is done by Hank Shockley and the Bomb Squad out of New York.
Yes,
that's right.
Yeah.
Jason, say it again
for the people in the back.
But that's what I'm saying though, is that like we got a false regionalness, right?
False.
When it came to music.
Think about this moment in time in hip hop, and I know some people are saying we're taking an anti-hip hop stance. It's just a dialectic, right? We can hold two truths. So
right.
Well, while the West Coast, East Coast beef is going off and people are selling records by the ton, and sadly, we lose two young men to this. Stars and countless others are caught up in the whole fracas as well. Master Ace, who's an OG New York rapper, does a West Coast remix of a song he has called Jeep Ass Nigga. Because the cats in New York had the Jeeps with the booming systems. He goes to the West Coast and he's like, well, this is a whole different culture out here. And he has a song called Born to Roll, which is literally Jeep Ass Nigga, but a more West Coast influenced sound. The beat's a little slower. The drums are from an 808, not sampled substitution James Brown loops that are so popular in New York. But this is going off in the middle of this thing that's, well, you're from New York, you're not supposed to be able to come down here and do this. And I feel like he just laughs in the face of all of it and makes one of the best songs of that era in Born to Roll.
Yeah. Another thing though, I could say, getting back to the whole thing about like Pascal mentioning, we were talking about how there were black people that did not like hip hop here in Chicago. A softening of that happened though with Public Enemy, with De La Soul and Tribe, when they're actually, because they started creating hip hop that we did start relating to. I mean, there was a message, and some of the early hip hop was just my car is this or that. It's like,
well, there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. You know why that is, Jeremiah?
Yes, sir.
Chicago is the Vatican of black nationalism.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, the neighborhood I lived in, we're with Michelle. She's closer to the mosque than I am, but we were right in that area. We were right near the 73rd and Stony Island Mosque. So yeah, it definitely. it's funny because when you guys have talked to Adolph Reed, sometimes when he talks about it, I'm like, maybe he was in the neighborhood too. Because when he talks about his Chicago experience, I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, no, he
So
lived in Chicago. I think he lived by the University of Chicago because remember that's where he originally notices the Obama phenomenon as it develops.
right, and the thing is that University of Chicago is in Hyde Park, which is like the it's like that oasis in Chicago. Chicago is very segregated. The South Side is very black, but Hyde Park, where University of Chicago is the one place in the South Side that's pretty much mixed because of the university. You know, you still have a lot of mixture of black and white in that area, but Chicago, it's very segregated. North Side is mostly white, Northwest Hispanic. You know, there's different areas like that, but Adolph, and so, but just south of Hyde Park, you get to South Shore, and that's where I live. You know, that's where I grew up. But South Shore is also like there's an area part of South Shore called the Highlands, and that's where Jesse Jackson had his home. Farrakhan had his home there, and Muhammad Ali. It's like that was part of South Shore too, right off of the park where Obama is building his library now.
Wow.
So yeah, and then people, I don't, you know, the funny thing is I might have met him. I mean, I have friends that I know that are friends of Obama's, but I don't know if I actually met him. I actually may have met him at a party years ago. You know, he may have been there at the same time, but I've never actually met him. But I do know friends that are.
You know,
friends
he
of
was at
his.
the new wave parties. Let's just be honest. He wasn't going to anything that fucking.
Well, but that's the thing. The new wave, most house music, a lot of people I knew who were into house music were also into new wave or punk. You know, I mean, that was the thing. It's like there was more of a openness to different music. You know, whereas hip hop was just like, no, this is what black people should like. This is what we're on. You know, it's like that. You know, kind of a.
Now, there's an aspect
So
that was in the documentary about like kind of like the competition within house, and like I think he's like even when it comes to hip hop, there's a lot of like competition is kind of like
Yes.
in
Yes.
the DNA of the music.
Yes.
And this is what I thought was interesting though, is like when just the idea of people being able to produce their own music and then use those samples.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the musical competition, but then how that also turns into a little bit of like monetary exploitation between the people who are making the music versus the DJs versus the people who are then able to produce albums.
The musical competition, let's just put it this way, there was really not much. I mean, there aren't many house music artists that made money because, and to some extent, that can create the whole thing of scarcity. You know, it's just like there was a lot of competition among the house music artists because only one or two of them got signed to major label deals. The major labels were not checking for house music artists, for black artists from Chicago or wherever. You know, it was just like there. You know, we got lucky because we got involved with CC and we did some tracks for her, but there was not a lot of support for the house music scene. You know, some of the artists, if you were a DJ and you kept that going, you could go make a living DJing in Europe and things like that, and you produce a few tracks that could get picked up and played over there. That's the way it would go. But there was not a lot of support. So there is this vibe of like within the house music scene, people would say, "Oh, brothers don't support each other," and there seems to be this competition thing. But I think that really comes from it is because there was so few crumbs to compete for that it did create that kind of competition. You know,
house music was not really commercially promoted in mainstream thoroughfare.
Exactly. And like I said, and I think the big reason was that it was too much related to disco, which they had already just said it sucks.
I got another reason that you're not hitting the reason, Jeremiah.
Go ahead, I'm ready for it. What is it?
House music did not appeal to the class that was necessary to exploit the stereotypical trope of an urban underclass ideology as effectively as hip hop.
Yeah, I mean,
Wow.
right, exactly. Yes, thank you. Because the
Wait
thing,
a minute. Wait a minute. Say that again, Pascal.
for the
House
people in the
music
back.
did not appeal to the class and
Yes.
was needed to easily exploit the trope of urban underclass as effectively as hip hop.
Here it comes.
It's weird to say it because in a way it's like house music was, I hate to say it, almost like it was like a bougie music in a way. It
Yo,
was like
yo. You know who loved the house music scene? Like loved the house music scene?
yes.
The black
Edu-
fraternities and sororities.
exactly, the educated black folks. It was just like, but yeah, it was just like that's, like I said, I went to high school with Michelle. We were the ones who made it out of the hood. We were the ones who got out. We were able to go to the good schools and things like that. And house music, to some extent, that was our music. And it was like, it wasn't like we were just following what white people said we should listen to in the hip hop. That, like I said, there was a rebellion against it because to us it felt like we were being pushed into this. Like it was like they were telling us this is the music you should like, and we were like, no, this is the music we like. And like I said, when you look at it, it makes sense, it being an extension of that cultural movement, into rediscovering our Africanness in a way. I hate to say it that way, but just getting back in touch with that culture, the whole rhythm of the drums and everything else. That, you know, that part of the music was just us going there for ourselves and not really caring about what the mass culture was telling us we should like.
And it's so sad because again, I think we think about this moment, and I talk about this a little bit when I was introducing you, and they talk about it in the documentary, and I found this very interesting. We do these shows, and we had a really great show a few months back. I think it was even last year with Alex Hukuli of the Off of Bunga Bunga podcast, talking about their book, The End of History. And when you think about the rise of this music, especially rave culture, which of course comes from house. It's very apolitical, but in the UK there's laws about rave music. Even here in the Bay Area there was laws about raves. Raves became like the most frightening thing for middle America to deal with, and a lot of it had to do with drug culture and the war on drugs. So as we talk about
here in Chicago, I'm sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, what I wanted to say was when we talk about like hip hop being the music that defines what black culture is, when you look at house music and even disco music, which also is an aspect of black culture, it's an aspect of black culture that's very welcoming of sexuality. It's almost freeing of sexuality, where hip hop is very, very constrict. It's almost conservative when it comes to sexuality.
Hip hop is conservative as fuck.
House music was like this whole bohemian thing. It was just like we were opening up to everything. Like I said, for us kids that were, growing up, and we thought we felt comfortable going to gay clubs. We didn't care about that. The music was hidden, so we would go. It was like that. That was something that was there. But of course, the guys who were in the hip hop, they're like, "Oh man, y'all going to them gay clubs?" There was that attitude with it. But yeah, there was already this cultural movement forward. That. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say too is like that's something that like you see early on with hip hop, but that's like literally like part of the core of house music is just like having a good time.
Right.
When that gets like bred out of hip hop.
I mean, house music to me, to some extent, it was like a lot of these people were like, hey, we got to go work with the white people during the day. We got to do this and everything. But in the weekends, this is how we're going to party. This is how we get together. We have our fun. This is the music we listen to. The music lifts us up. Like the whole thing, the gospel era element of it to some extent was like, yeah, it was very spiritual. It was uplifting, It's like, I think there's an old phrase that they say some people go to church on Sunday so they can get up and go to work on Monday. It's like there's that element of spiritual uplift. And to some extent, house was that. It was like a very uplifting thing. I always compare it to, the Bob Marley song, a redemption song?
Yeah.
Won't you help me sing these songs of freedom? Because all I ever have is redemption songs. Redemption songs to me is hip hop. House was trying to be songs of freedom.
Mm.
It definitely had that kind of aesthetic, no doubt. I mean, particularly when you stick like Afro beat. I mean, when you start now,
Right.
It's just it was very much a deep. I mean, there were times you go to a club and you just hear the of a house
Right.
cut, and
Right.
it literally everybody. I don't care what color, what background, everyone goes to almost this kind of like tribal essence of just like do. It's
Yes,
like
and that's
it's
what I said
incredible,
about the
man.
whole connection of the reconnection with our African roots. It's just like because when you even see like look at like what's going on in the Afro house music thing. You've got this guy Black Coffee now that's nominated for a Grammy. Out of South Africa, what's going on? I mean, we touched on something that affected the rest of the world. And in Chicago, I mean, by keeping the whole house thing alive, it blew up around the world. We didn't benefit from it. Not so many of us made the money, but you can see that we did start something or helped to start something. It kept it alive because, I have to give credit to New York. And there were New York artists, New York and Jersey. I mean, it was something we were all doing. Chicago just ended up being the center for it. And maybe it was because we were the what was it again? The Black Nationalists. What is it?
The Vatican of Black
The
nationalism.
Vatican of Black Nationalists. And so we get the credit for it, but it was just a different turn in Black music. It was like a different expression of our cultural identity in a way. And it's just like, there's nothing wrong with hip hop. There's a lot of people who like both, but it was just like we were forced to think that hip hop was the only thing that could represent us.
Well, no,
that
you're being too kind. We were forced to believe that hip hop was the only music Black people could create.
Yes, exactly. I mean, there's even now. It's like it's crazy because I had an experience that there's a story that goes around Chicago in the music scene about the Rolling Stones. When they came to Chicago, they were brought to the North Side by a not a promoter, some white kids that wanted to get them to play early on in their career, and they came into the town. They were there a day early, and so they were like, "Well, what do you want to do?" The guys asked them, and they were like, "Oh, we want to go to the Peppermint Lounge." And the promoters were like, "What? Where?" You know, and they were like, "What are you talking about? What do you mean where?" The Peppermint Lounge. The music we make has been inspired by these Black artists, and they play at the Peppermint Lounge on the south side of this city. We want to go there. And these kids that brought them in on the north side had no idea of what that was. And I had a similar experience. I was in a lift on the ride home, and the kid was playing house music. It wasn't techno. It was like the guy I was riding it in the car. He was playing like stuff that I was like, okay, wait a minute, this is actually house. It wasn't like the typical EDM kind of stuff. And I was like, oh, okay, you like real house music. And he was like, oh yeah, I'm from Chicago. I love house. I was like, oh, okay, here's a breakthrough. I mean, they know where it comes. But then when I started talking to him about it, he had no idea of the actual history of it. He just had this vague idea. Oh yeah, Chicago's supposed to be the history. I mean, there's one guy, Skrillex.
Mm.
This company I was working with, they sponsored this big thing in Soldier Field, this Spring Awakening rave fest thing. And so I got tickets to go, and I'm like, I want to check this guy out to hear his DJ. I actually like some of his productions, to be honest. Yeah. But I wanted to check him out, and it was funny because in the middle, in his set, he was playing this track. I forget, that doesn't matter. But he said, "Chicago, where it all started," and it was just like almost like silence. I looked around, and like some of these kids were like what,
On the seventh day, Lord created Chicago.
Well, Skrillex also comes from a very trendy scene in heavy music, and he left that before he even did really anything big with it, and got into what's now known as dubstep.
Right.
which kind of blows my mind. Again, when we talk about the through line between these musics, when I work at EDC, which is maybe the largest rave in North America, I think it's like 175,000 people a day in Vegas. All I see is metal shirts in the crowd. And it's because of the drop. That's the big thing in the music, is they call it the drop.
Right, the big build up. Right. Yeah.
Then the 4 on the floor kicks in and people lose their shit. And it's very similar to the breakdown in heavy music, but that's where Skrillex comes from.
Yeah, and that's the turn that EDM took. You know, it's kind of interesting because like I said, there's a documentary I gave you guys about it's called Pump Up the Volume. It was done by Channel 4.
Yes.
In the UK.
Great documentary.
Love that documentary.
Probably the best documentary on house music I've ever seen. Definitely be better than the one that Idris Elba did.
Wow.
Well, Idris
Elba.
No, Idris Elba.
His good one. His was good, but it was more international, and it focused a little bit more on the British scene than the American scene.
Yeah, and Idris's thing does more to tell you how this got away from us. You know, it really focuses more on how it got commercialized and everything else, and how house music was really taken over. So when we talk about the whole commercialization and the monetization, it's like we blew up out of Chicago. We kind of, you know, helped the UK, you know, take this on as their genre. But then they started just promoting guys and everything else, and then they blew up. They started making all the money, and just like with any other genre of black music, the originators are kind of left behind. You know, I mean, the same thing happened with rock and roll. Like I said, the story with the Stones. You know, they a lot of those black artists that they were into were struggling while they were getting rich.
When did that transition happen? When house music starts to go to Britain? How can you talk about that process?
What's really interesting is that you had the two labels in Chicago, Trax and DJ International. I made a couple records for DJ International. They actually were just looking for a way to sell this music. It was selling big in Chicago, and I think they were selling some in New York, but it wasn't really taking off anywhere else in the States. So they were looking for they were looking for an outlet, and they started pushing the music. There's this thing called MedM, which goes on in Cannes every year, and it's like a way for different record distributors to get together and make deals. So it's like, you know, you can play your stuff, you know, hook up with different distributors and see if they can go promote your stuff in different countries. And basically they did that, and somehow it caught on, especially in the north of England. There's a good part in that documentary where they talk about how there was this Northern Soul movement in Manchester, England, and that to some extent it was like somehow it was a fertile ground for house to really take off there. So when the DJ started playing it, they related to the music because they already had a scene that was kind of similar, where they liked a lot of black soul music, you know, and they got it with house music. Even though it was electronic, they knew they could still hear the soul in it, you know. So that is where the music transitioned to England. At first, though, there was a resistance in London because they were into what was mainstream. So London was the place for hip hop. I mean, hip hop. They were trying to grow hip hop in London, you know, and R&B and stuff was, you know, it was the mainstream culture was in London, so it was resistant. But in the north of England, this house thing was really catching on, and you got to think about it to some extent too. Some of the European cultures, they didn't relate to hip hop the same way everybody else did. I mean, we did in America. I mean, it was like, yeah, okay, the tracks may be nice, but there wasn't a cultural connection to some extent. I think house and disco was something they could already relate to, you know. So that music, that's how we were able to pierce that market. And we had a couple of tracks that were, like I said, Steve Hurley, the guy I worked with, he did a song, Jack Your Body, which actually went to #1 on the UK charts.
Jack your body, jack your body, jack your body.
And there was another top 10, Love Can't Turn Around, which Farley Jackmaster Funk I worked with. He did that one. You know, there were a few other ones, and that it really influenced them that there were so many DJs in UK and Europe that started adopting the music, and they were like, okay, this is what we're playing now. And then they started making their own tracks, and that's what grew into the EDM movement, and that's where we are now to some extent.
EDM being electronic dance music.
Yeah. Yep.
What,
Because
like,
all these genres kind of broke out of it. You know, it's like you were talking about, like I was saying, like how house came out of the disco thing, which kind of a exploration of our Afro-Caribbean roots into soul music. But then, you know, like with dubstep and other things like that, you've got the artists there trying to take what was going on with some of the, you know, some of the black Afro-Caribbean music there too, like with Jamaican, with dance hall and things like that. You know, they were trying to incorporate some of that vibe into the music. And when you talk about Skrillex with dubstep, I mean that's just an offshoot of, you know, dance hall and jungle. You know.
do you think with Chicago footwork, that's kind of like, I guess, a
Yeah.
scene currently?
Yeah.
I don't know. You see that as like kind of like Chicago once again, you know, trying to revitalize, you know, and that's the thing too, is like I think you do like a lot of like Afro-Caribbean beats, but even like sped up faster than what House was
Yeah.
doing. Um,
Yeah.
so I don't know. I guess like I'm just wondering if like if you interested in that scene, if you see it as something like that's kind of like, I guess, yeah, an offshoot, an offspring of some of the music you help create.
Oh no, definitely. I mean, that whole the footwork thing, even to some extent, some of that scene was originally, we would call it ghetto house, you know. And it was just like, it was the, you know, somewhat faster, broken down, you know, not as musical, you know, but it's kind of like what happened with a lot of the guys that were in the hip hop were like, okay, but this is the kind of house we can like. you
Yeah.
know, we can't get into that other house because that sounds kind of soft to us or something like that or whatever. But Chicago is such a scene for house. It's like had to eventually be some kind of offshoot that would be more of a combination of the hip hop scene, you know. And I
Yes.
think that footwork thing kind of comes out of that. Yeah.
Well, it's getting late. We've been going for 2 hours now, and apparently for the people watching on YouTube, there was a bit of a copyright strike, but that's okay. You can watch the full show on Twitter. You can watch the full show on Facebook. Definitely can watch the full show on Twitch, I believe. Does that stay up, Marcus, on Twitch or no?
You will have I think you got 24 hours
Okay.
with where you're at.
Okay, we can watch it on Twitch, and definitely we'll have the show up on I'll put the whole show up on Patreon.
We got to get you to affiliate status and then partner on Twitch. We gotta make some moves.
I'm one step away. I'm one step away from doing it. So, Jeremiah, you blew our mind. I was already looking at you on Discogs, seeing your connections with the scene, and then when you dropped the CC Peniston bomb, my mind is blown.
Hey, you guys blow my mind every week, man. I love your
Oh
podcast,
man, thank you for that, brother.
Thank you. That's a compliment.
This is required listening for me now. I listen to you guys it's interesting because there's so much more I can get into with this too, because, you know, having come up in the PMC, I mean, I went to high school with Jesse Jackson's kids too. You know, it's like I came up with all of this. I came up through all of that stuff, man.
What?
Damn. Well, I mean, I think I can speak for the rest of the crew when I say, Jeremiah, we would love to have you back.
Yes.
We could, because House Music Part 2, and like this is something Pascal's been talking about, I think,
the
since I
class
met
stuff
this
that
fool.
Pascal you talk about, man, I just so relate to that because, like I said, growing up in this and seeing that, I mean, just Obama turned me off from an episode of when he was on Stephen Colbert, and they were throwing things at a trash can, trying to throw paper into a trash can, and he missed all of them. And this is funny that it hit me with this. And then when he ended the segment, he said, "Man, I lost my swag on Stephen Colbert." You know.
Fucking clown.
And I was just like, at that moment, I was like, he reminded me of all the dudes I hated in high school. You know.
Well, hey, thank you very much, Brother Jeremiah. I am going to. I'm trying to do it. Can I do it? Oh, there it goes. Can we hear it? We're gonna play some music on the way out. Can you hear that? This is as close as I get to house music for you, Pascal. You had asked me to make some house music. This is like as close as it gets. I will say I played the bass line. And I played the shit out of this bass line. And Jeremiah, you know about music.
Hey, give it to me, man. I'll do a remix.
F sharp. This is in drop F sharp. My bass is tuned to, so that's low.
Get the stems to me, man. I'll do a remix.
Bruh, you said nothing but a word. I got your email, Negro. I got your email, Negro. I will send you a Dropbox of the stems and feel nothing. Pascal.
I'm right here.
Thank you very much. Marcus. Thank you very much. Everybody listening. Thank you very much.
Oh, you know what? And I just saw the spook who sat by the door. I got to tell you about my conversation with Sam Greenlee, the guy that wrote that.
Oh man,
we got a whole nother show. We got a whole nother show. Hear this, Pascal? This is for you, Pascal.
Jeremiah went from guest to executive producer of the show, just like that. Damn.
So Tuesday, we will be talking with Cedric Johnson about his new book, The Panthers Can't Save Us Now. And Monday, Pascal and I will be doing our last interview for The Real News. Here it comes, here it comes, here it comes. Woo!
Okay.
It's got more of a trappy feel.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. And we are out.
We're still here.